Picture the scene: you're a Roman senator of high rank, among the most honored men in the empire. Your lineage stretches back through centuries, your toga marked with the purple edge of nobility, and your life has been spent in loyal service to Rome. Tonight, a golden summons has arrived. Dinner with the emperor himself, the kind of privilege that should swell your chest with pride. Yet as you climb the polished marble stairs of the Palatine Palace, a knot of dread tightens in your gut. The guards at the doorway refuse to meet your gaze. They understand what lies ahead, and their silence says more than words ever could. The perfume of rare incense drifts through the air, but it cannot cover the heavier presence of fear, thick, stifling, inescapable. Stepping into the vast hall, you find Rome's elite already assembled. Senators with their wives, rich traders, hardened generals, all standing uneasily, no one daring to break the hush. Then it comes, the echo of approaching footsteps, followed by bursts of wild laughter that make your veins run cold. Caligula appears, robed in silk that gleams like molten gold, his eyes burning with a feverish gleam. He sweeps the gathering with the look of a beast choosing its next victim, before striking his hands together in a show of mock joy. "My friends," he proclaims, his voice bouncing from the marble columns. "Tonight we will uncover who among you truly loves your emperor. Tonight we shall test how far your loyalty can reach." From there, the evening collapses into a spectacle that tears apart every boundary of Roman decency, transforming the palace into a theater for the ruler's darkest cravings. It is a tale of how one man's madness poisoned an empire, how unchecked power rotted into corruption. Before we plunge into these long-buried accounts of endurance and despair, let me ask, if stories like this capture your imagination, be sure to press like, subscribe for more, and share in the comments where you're tuning in from. It amazes me that we can uncover such ancient lives together, joined across the world by a shared curiosity about history. To grasp how the most powerful figure of his age twisted his palace into a den of cruelty and perversion, we must look at how Caligula first rose to the throne. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in the year 12, the boy gained the nickname Caligula, Little Boots, when he followed his father Germanicus on campaigns, wearing tiny soldier's gear that won the adoration of the legions. Yet childhood in the imperial household was far from innocent. By the age of 7, Caligula had already endured his father's suspicious death, likely a poisoning arranged by Tiberius himself. He saw his mother Agrippina the Elder and his brothers dragged away into exile, prison, and eventually death, crushed beneath the paranoia of palace politics. Now imagine being a boy, never knowing if the next knock at the door would be your execution. Caligula adapted to survive in a realm where weakness meant death, where trust was a trap. He perfected the mask of harmlessness, learning to conceal himself while the empire devoured his family one by one. This early trauma later revealed itself in Caligula's constant urge to control and belittle others, especially those who reminded him of the authority that had haunted his childhood. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the Roman people welcomed the 24-year-old Caligula with true joy. Here was the son of their admired Germanicus, the boy who once delighted the legions on campaign. After decades under the suspicious and reclusive Tiberius, Rome longed for a youthful leader who promised to restore past glory. At first, Caligula seemed to be exactly what they had wished for. In his opening months he recalled exiles, rewarded the Praetorian Guard with generous payments, and arranged magnificent games for the crowds. His popularity soared, but soon things began to shift, and the imperial residence slowly turned from a seat of government into a stage for the emperor's darkest indulgences. Late in 37 CE, Caligula became dangerously ill with what ancient writers describe as a violent brain fever, so severe that the empire almost stopped functioning. For days he hovered on the edge of death while the capital prayed for his recovery. Some historians argue this illness left lasting damage to his mind, while others believe it simply tore away the thin layer of reason that had kept his impulses restrained. Once he recovered, those closest to him noticed the change immediately. The careful young man who had once shown wisdom was gone. In his place stood someone who no longer recognized limits, someone who blurred every line between sacred and forbidden, acceptable and unimaginable. To the public, the change wasn't obvious at first. It began with smaller things. Reckless spending, odd behavior in private councils, decisions that grew increasingly unstable. But behind the palace doors, a darker reality unfolded. Caligula had realized during his brush with death that, as emperor, he could do absolutely anything to anyone, and nothing could stop him. The palace servants were the first to feel the impact. Longtime attendants suddenly faced bizarre orders and degrading commands. Young male slaves, in particular, became especially vulnerable. Caligula would call servants into his private quarters and compel them to engage in acts that shattered every idea of Roman honor. Yet it was the women in the household who endured the worst. Ancient writers, careful with their wording, record how the emperor would stalk the palace halls at night, selecting women at will to satisfy his desires. These were not consensual meetings but demonstrations of domination, designed to prove his absolute authority over everyone within reach. His lusts were not confined to slaves alone. Soon he summoned the wives of senators and high officials, pretending the meeting was to discuss politics or family affairs. For these women, raised in the rigid values of Roman nobility, refusal meant death, not only for themselves but for their loved ones as well. One chilling account recalls Caligula ordering them to strip and perform degrading acts in front of him, sometimes pitting several women against each other for his attention. The cruelty of the humiliation was as deliberate as the physical abuse. These women, once honored throughout Rome, were reduced to little more than objects for the emperor's amusement. What made his corruption of the palace even more terrifying was not only the abuse itself but the systematic way he used sex as a weapon to dismantle Rome's social order. Caligula knew that by forcing the elite to participate in or witness such degradation, he could crush their pride more effectively than through chains or torture. He began staging banquets that opened with refined dining but soon descended into orgies. Senators and their wives, even daughters, were invited under the guise of cultured gatherings. But as the night wore on, the emperor's commands grew more obscene. "Senator Marcus," he might remark casually, as if asking for another cup of wine, "your wife has the loveliest eyes. I wonder how they appear when she kneels before me." The senator would sit in silence, knowing resistance would doom his family. His wife, meanwhile, would be forced into submission before her husband and children, the shame unbearable for all. The damage to families was lasting. Marriages broken, children scarred, proud Roman households reduced to props for the emperor's twisted pleasure. Caligula seemed to enjoy most the sight of senators watching helplessly as their wives were degraded, seating them in places where they could not avoid seeing every act of humiliation. One report tells how he forced the bride's father to witness him consummating the marriage before the entire gathering, turning what should have been a sacred act into a public show of domination. Caligula's sexual urges were not simply for his own pleasure. They became a tool of economic coercion against Rome's wealthiest families. He would single out the most attractive wives and daughters of prominent citizens, demanding access to them in return for their family's safety and continued fortune. This practice created a grotesque market where nobles had no choice but to offer their female relatives as payment for political support or mere survival. Invitations arrived for women to attend private audiences with the emperor, and although families knew exactly what awaited them, refusal meant risking their estates and lives. Caligula even set up a formal levy built around sexual service. Prominent families were required to provide their women for defined periods inside the palace, the length and frequency depending on their wealth. It was not prostitution in the ordinary sense but outright sexual slavery, forced upon the empire's elite as proof of absolute power. Women who resisted or tried to escape faced horrific reprisals. Some were compelled to perform sexual acts in public as entertainment during gladiatorial shows, while others were pushed into real prostitution, their noble rank stripped away as they were forced to serve soldiers and slaves. The warning was unmistakable. No one, no matter their birth or position, was outside the emperor's reach. For the women who became part of Caligula's sexual theater, the effects were devastating and lasting. These were women raised under the rigid moral traditions of Rome's aristocracy, taught that chastity was their greatest value and duty to family and empire their highest calling. To be reduced to objects for the emperor's pleasure inflicted psychological wounds that stretched far beyond physical abuse. Many were compelled to commit acts that defiled not only their personal dignity but also their deepest religious beliefs. The clash between their upbringing and their forced degradation often led to total mental collapse. Some chose suicide rather than endure, but Caligula anticipated such defiance. Families of women who killed themselves suffered collective punishment, sometimes death, sometimes financial destruction that wiped out entire lineages. Thus women were trapped between protecting their personal honor and preserving their families, with no escape that did not bring ruin. The emperor seemed to enjoy most of all breaking those who resisted at first. He would subject them to ever more humiliating acts until their defiance disappeared completely, their spirits crushed beneath his unchecked power. These women, once broken in spirit, were then displayed as living warnings, their total submission serving to intimidate others and to show the fate of anyone who opposed the emperor's wishes. What proved even more devastating to the mind was the way Roman men were forced into complicity in the humiliation of their own households. Senators and senior officials were not merely passive witnesses to the mistreatment of their wives and daughters. They were often required to take part in arranging, preparing, and even facilitating these encounters. Caligula would demand that fathers personally escort their daughters into his chambers, that husbands assist in readying their wives for encounters, or that brothers restrain their sisters during group activities. This compelled involvement created a deeper level of psychological torment than simply watching from the side. These men became unwilling collaborators in the destruction of their own families. The emperor knew that by forcing men to take part in the dishonor of their loved ones, he stripped away any last shred of dignity or authority they possessed. A senator who had helped bind his wife for the emperor's satisfaction could never again hold the same respect in the Senate. His standing was permanently ruined by his role in his family's degradation. Some men attempted resistance by refusing to bring their wives or daughters to the palace, but Caligula had foreseen such defiance. Families who failed to comply were punished immediately, often with execution carried out in public to set an example. The decision was cruelly simple. Take part in the humiliation of your household or face their death before your eyes. One of the most disturbing features of Caligula's reign was the inclusion of children in palace affairs. Ancient accounts, though written with caution, make it clear that his desires extended to minors, both boys and girls, drawn from the most prominent Roman families. Young ones brought to gatherings inside the palace were made to witness acts no child should be forced to see, leaving scars that endured for the rest of their lives. Some were even compelled to take part in the encounters themselves, their innocence stripped away as part of the emperor's deliberate campaign to corrupt every layer of Roman society. The lasting damage was enormous. Many grew into adulthood unable to form ordinary relationships, their understanding of intimacy permanently distorted by what they had experienced as children in the palace. Others continued the cycle, becoming perpetrators themselves once they reached power, repeating the very patterns that had been forced upon them. Caligula seemed aware that by targeting the children of Rome's aristocracy, he guaranteed that his corruption would outlive him. Those boys and girls, destined to be Rome's next generation of leaders, carried within them the deep wounds of their palace upbringing, and with those wounds came the risk of passing on the cycle of degradation for decades to come. As his rule advanced, Caligula began shaping his intimate practices into something resembling a religious cult built around the worship of his person. He proclaimed himself a living deity and demanded that the indecent acts carried out in his name be recognized as sacred rituals. This was not simple madness but a deliberate strategy to legitimize his exploitation by covering it with the language of religion. Shrines were erected inside the palace complex where participants were compelled to perform intimate rites as proof of their devotion to the divine emperor. These were not voluntary ceremonies of worship. They were enforced performances required of anyone seeking imperial approval or even just trying to avoid imperial punishment. The emperor devised elaborate festivals around his encounters, complete with formal procedures and ritual elements. Relations with the emperor, or with his chosen proxies, were described as a kind of communion with the divine, while observing these encounters was declared an act of worship demanded of all who entered the palace. This framework of religion gave Caligula an excuse for even his most outrageous requirements. When the wives of senators were ordered into group relations, it was explained as a sacred obligation rather than the emperor's whim. When children were involved in these rituals, it was described as their initiation into divine mysteries rather than the corruption of innocence. Caligula's campaign of intimate terror was not confined to the palace but spread across the empire through a network of officials who copied his practices in his name. Provincial governors, army leaders, and other representatives of imperial power were urged to create their own versions of the emperor's court of indulgence, forming an empire-wide system of violation and control. These officials understood that their future depended on cooperating in and enabling this exploitation. They competed with one another to invent new methods of humiliation, reporting their innovations to Rome in the hope of earning imperial favor. The consequence was an empire where degradation became a recognized instrument of rule. Ordinary people lived in constant fear that their wives, daughters, or sons could be demanded for service to imperial agents. This fostered a climate of dread reaching far beyond the palace walls, touching millions throughout the Roman world. Women across the provinces learned to live knowing their bodies were not their own, that at any time they might be summoned by representatives of the emperor for such purposes. This organized system of intimate terror became one of the hallmarks of Caligula's time in power, leaving psychological scars that would remain with Roman society for generations. By the year 40 CE, the emperor's excesses had reached extremes that shocked even those who had endured his earlier outrages. Palace gatherings degenerated into massive spectacles of indecency that could last for days, with hundreds of unwilling participants compelled to perform increasingly extreme displays. The emperor's last months were defined by performances of intimacy on a scale of unmatched excess and cruelty. He staged vast gatherings that included senators, their households, foreign envoys, attendants, and even animals, arranging indecent displays that symbolized his absolute command over human honor and morality. These spectacles appeared intended not only for personal satisfaction but also as demonstrations of the very essence of imperial control. By compelling Rome's most honored citizens to join in the most degrading encounters, Caligula seemed to be making a grim statement that traditional Roman values meant nothing when confronted with limitless power. The breaking point arrived when he declared his intention to establish his practices as the official faith of the empire, demanding that all citizens participate in ritual acts as proof of loyalty. This plan to formalize and universalize his reign of terror finally persuaded the conspiracy to strike. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula was killed by members of the Praetorian Guard in the hidden corridors of his own palace. Yet even in death, the emperor's crimes continued to cast fear over those he had harmed. The plot against him carried not only political goals but also deeply personal ones. Several of the assassins had been forced to witness their relatives subjected to his violations. The new emperor, Claudius, faced the heavy burden of confronting the aftermath of Caligula's reign of degradation. The physical remnants of his crimes were overwhelming. Rooms fitted for torment, collections of indecent artwork portraying real victims of the palace, and meticulous records of encounters used as blackmail against noble families. Much of this evidence was carefully destroyed, not in tribute to Caligula but to shield victims and their families from renewed disgrace. Spaces where such acts had occurred were sealed off or completely rebuilt, as though the new regime sought to erase every trace. The effort to cover up reached into the historical record as well. Ancient writers documented his offenses, but often in guarded language that concealed the full extent of what took place. Many victims and their households welcomed this discretion, knowing that public detail would only deepen their humiliation. The most tragic element of Caligula's campaign of exploitation was how thoroughly it silenced those who suffered. Roman culture, with its deep emphasis on honor and family standing, made it nearly impossible for survivors to speak openly without destroying what remained of their reputations. Women who had been violated by the emperor faced a society that would blame them regardless of circumstance. Men who had been forced to witness the dishonor of their wives could not tell their stories without admitting their own helplessness and involvement. Children who had seen or endured such corruption often carried their pain wordlessly for the rest of their lives. This wall of silence ensured that the true scope of Caligula's crimes may never be fully uncovered. Families torn apart by violation had every reason to bury the memory. While Roman historians were limited by social customs that forbade explicit description of such matters, the silence also guaranteed that countless victims never received recognition or justice. The new administration focused on preserving political order, not on addressing past wrongs, leaving survivors alone with their grief and trauma, unacknowledged and unsupported. The violations committed inside Caligula's palace produced consequences that stretched far beyond his short 4-year rule. The psychological wounds inflicted on Rome's upper class created patterns of dysfunction that haunted society for generations. Children who had seen or endured exploitation within the palace grew into adults with deeply distorted ideas of intimacy, power, and human connection. Many of them became perpetrators themselves, unable to separate normal expressions of desire from the abusive practices learned in youth. Others remained victims, their early trauma leaving them vulnerable to further manipulation and harm. Families who managed to survive Caligula's reign often carried permanent scars from their ordeals. Marriages torn apart by forced encounters rarely healed, while children raised in an atmosphere of constant fear struggled to form stable bonds later in life. The social foundation of Rome's aristocracy was permanently weakened by the systematic corruption of its most prominent members. Perhaps most importantly, Caligula's campaign of exploitation created a model of imperial misconduct that reappeared throughout Roman history. Later emperors, though perhaps not reaching Caligula's extremes, recognized that the misuse of intimacy was a powerful instrument for controlling rivals and eliminating opposition. Today, visitors walk through the remains of the Palatine Hill, admiring traces of ancient magnificence without realizing the horrors that once unfolded behind those walls. The same marble floors that once echoed with screams and cries of unwilling captives now host tour groups and lectures on Roman art and architecture. Yet for those who know what to seek, the evidence still lingers. Foundations that supported chambers designed for torment. Drainage systems that once carried away the remains of countless violations. Subterranean corridors where terrified victims waited their turn to be summoned before the emperor. The shadows of Caligula's victims continue to haunt these ruins. The senator's wife who chose death rather than endure another night of imperial demands. The 10-year-old boy who watched his mother suffer unspeakable torment. The noble matron reduced to a degraded servant within the palace brothel. Their voices were erased from history, but their pain remains etched into the very stones of this place. Caligula's reshaping of the imperial palace into a stage of intimate horror lasted less than 4 years. Yet its effects echoed across Roman history and still resonate in memory today. The palace may lie in ruins now, but its lessons remain. The organized violation of the weak by those in power is not simply a remnant of ancient cruelty. It is a recurring pattern whenever human beings are handed unchecked authority and decide to wield it for destructive ends. The only real difference between Caligula's campaign of degradation and modern forms of exploitation lies in scale and in the records preserved. The essential dynamics of dominance, coercion, and misuse of intimacy have remained unsettlingly constant through the centuries. In the end, the emperor who converted his palace into a spectacle of depravity left behind more than traumatized victims and political upheaval. He established a model of exploitation that later tyrants would study and, at times, imitate. His legacy is not written in marble triumphs or bronze plaques, but in the psychological wounds carried forward through generations of sufferers. A stark reminder that the gravest crimes are often those that damage not only bodies, but also spirits.